friends, today's lecture by Dr. Richa Bajaj, who teaches English in Hindu College, Delhi University, is on Amrita Pritam, the well-known Indian writer, and she wrote originally in Punjabi. She was translated extensively in Hindi, and she had a very fine presence in English also. And because it's a contemporary writer, it's a woman, it's a poet of our times, that is, and she is available equally well in English. Therefore, she is a part of this series for discussion. Amrita Pritam was till the other day with us in Delhi. She lived in Green Park, New Delhi, and she would of course come to many colleges, the university and other places also, and she was a living legend in her own lifetime. So, what further ado, she wrote novels, she wrote short stories, she wrote originally, she wrote extensively poetry, expressed herself, she was a poet of love, and she expressed that feeling in Punjabi very fluently. So, with any further discussion or detail, I hand over the mic to Professor Bajaj, and please begin your lecture on Amrita Pritam.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. In fact, it was interesting to hear from you. I would like you to reminisce and tell us something, since you've met the poet and you've met her on a couple of occasions. Would you like to share with the viewers what kind of a woman she was?
I've come to listen to you, your insights, and you're a poet yourself. So you are better equipped to handle this very lively subject of literature with us. So please.
Okay, we'll come probably later and ask sir to give us some insights into what his interactions were with Amrita Pritam. But yes, she was a living legend, and she lived through the 20th century. Her dates are 1919 to 2005. So this is the period that spans Amrita Pritam's life, and very rightly said that she is as much a poet of love as she is she's much a beloved poet of Punjab. And in fact, at a time when a lot of writers, a lot of her contemporaries were writing in Urdu and even Hindi, she decided to choose Punjabi as the medium of writing. And in fact, in one of her interviews with Carlo Coppola, the interviewer asked her why she chose Punjabi and not Urdu. She said, I love Urdu. Like, if you ask me, I love Urdu, and I know my contemporaries, my friends like Manto and others, they all are writing in Urdu. She said, but I chose Punjabi because my father was deeply devoted to the Punjabi language and the pluralist cultures of Punjab, and he himself was a Punjabi poet, writer, and he tried to bring in the kind of a confluence of the Sufi traditions, Hindu Muslims, and he was a lot into Sufism. So part of it, I think in that interview, in fact, Amrita Pritam said, I just wanted to please my father. That was my basic point, and just to give you a sense of her history also, she's therefore a much known like Punjabi poet, fiction writer and essayist, and also a recipient of Sahitya Academy Award in 1956. She got that, and as I told you, her father was a Punjabi writer and was deeply influenced by the Punjabi culture, and he tried himself to write on those lines and was into Sikhism as much as he was in Sufism. So and Amrita Pritam lost her mother at a very early age of 11. So she grew up as a loner, quite by herself, and her father encouraged her to write and read, and she started writing at a very early age. In fact, she said that she was barely 15 when she started writing her first poems, and primarily she wrote them in Punjabi but also sometimes in Hindi, and she was very interested in reading English literature. She in fact translated Robert Frost's poems in Punjabi. She also translated Edgar Allan Poe in Punjabi. So it's not, so there is a kind of an interaction with the West that constantly shaped her opinion and understanding. She really enjoyed reading Steinbeck. She mentioned that again in one of her interviews. So Amrita Pritam grew up in a very lively literary atmosphere, with a father who was devoted to Sufism, Sikhism, and grew up, it was a conservative also, orthodox sort of society, but she rebelled against that as well. So, it's very interesting to note her kind of life. And she was married then at an early age, and she was married to this prosperous trading family in Lahore. And in fact, she took her husband's first name. Her husband's name was Pritam Singh, and she took the name Pritam as the surname, and she became Amrita Pritam. She ditched the Kaur in her name and she took up Amrita Pritam. Since then, she is known as Amrita Pritam because she took her husband's name, and it was a it was a moment of great pride for him. And yet the two drifted apart, and Amrita Pritam in fact then chose wholeheartedly her writing career. She in fact had strove really hard to work and to build her own career and become independent. And very soon, because of her work, she was invited to conferences abroad. She visited Soviet Russia a couple of times, and she gained recognition abroad as well as at home. She also won the Bharatiya Gyanpith Award in 1983. So a lot of accolades to her name in that sense. So we are meeting a personality who was very vivid, rebellious at the same time, and yet loved by the people of her own state. Especially people in Punjab really look up to her as a kind of and as a feminist voice in Indian literatures. When we speak of Indian literatures translated in English, and especially poetry, we cannot of course miss Amrita Pritam in this regard. So this is the kind of background I thought that I would like to give on Amrita Pritam. Now, as Professor Prakash mentioned, Amrita Pritam wrote one very beautiful, I'd say, love poems and also erotic poems, but she also wrote a lot about Punjab, and particularly the period of partition really influenced her personality and really influenced her person. She was really pained at this entire partition period, and in fact has written one of her very famous poems, Aaj Aakha Waris Shah no. So in that poem, in fact, she calls Waris Shah and invokes the figure of Waris Shah to come back to Punjab and write a tale of love and suffering, as women in Punjab suffered at the time. So she would say, Aaj Aakha Waris Shah nu ke tu kabra vicho bol. So in a way, asking Waris Shah to speak from his grave and to speak about the the pain and suffering of all the women in Punjab at the time of partition. So there is this one very important angle, and there are a lot of these poems written around this period on this, including her novel, which is Pinjar, translated as The Skeleton in and also translated in English as Skeleton. So this was based on the partition period. So she wrote the novel, she wrote a lot of poems on the partition period and the suffering of women at the time. This was one area of her work, and the second was to do with love and the tender emotions of friendship and love that she tried to invoke through other poems of hers. So most of them were of course written for Sahir Ludhianvi, who's a writer in his own right. How would you look at this kind of literary atmosphere that was building at the time, Amrita Pritam becoming influenced by Sahir Ludhianvi, and then the culture of the period? How do you respond to that?
The most important word, Dr. Bajaj, that you have used is love, and that took her in different directions, and she would find love in Sufism, she would find love in rebellion, she would find love in being a woman. And all these things combined in her personality. In fact, people who didn't know her, they would always create, a kind of persona of her on the basis of her writing. And she would come out as a very sensitive person, as a person who appealed to a larger audience of women as well as men. And since she was the voice of love from Punjab, therefore people were fascinated by her writing and by her presence wherever she went. So all these things are well drafted by you, and I think you should continue with more
So
insights.
the third angle, of her poem. So one was this poetry on Punjab and partition. Second on love and to do with her love. Feeling of love or for Sahir Ludhianvi, and the third is related to her feeling of being a woman. So I think it's to do with her selfhood and identity that she tries to foreground in a lot of her poems. And there's a lot of pain and suffering in those kinds of poems that you find, which are very personal and deeply individual in that sense. So I think there are those three very important categories, and a fourth category, if one might add, would also be the category where she becomes very social and and political in her own writing, you know. And there was a period, in fact, a phase where she was very deeply influenced and admired the kind of Marxist enterprise, and, you know, she was devoted. But then later on she said that I don't want to be attached to any movement, and I prefer being called a poet and a creative writer over everything else. So as a creative writer, maybe she became uncomfortable with that ideological bent, but there was a phase in her life when she was very deeply impressed by this kind of people-oriented sort of literature that was also available because of Soviet Russia at the time. So I think these are the four corners in which you can place Amrita Pritam's, you know, the framework that you can use to that you can create for Amrita Pritam. I will be speaking to you about the Punjab-centric poem that is Aja Khan Waris Shah, and discuss you know, what led to it and how she went about it. And there are other poems of the same category, such as Frenzy, Helplessness, where she speaks about the same experience in different form. And you know, so basically what she was trying to do was that she was trying to project a period that was gripped with you know, this kind of fear psychosis, so to speak, you know, where moral values completely vanished and everybody was suspicious of everybody else. So there was a kind of a paranoia around you know, that was filtering in society, or was in a way percolating down to the lived experience. So she felt that, you know, this was the land of love, this was the land of Waris Shah, and all the values that Waris Shah had you know, projected in his works, in his tale of Heer and Ranjha on love and friendship, they were being eroded during this period. And so she, you know, she vividly recalls these dark nights on the train that she had, and compares it with the kind of destruction and death that occurred during Waris Shah's time. And in Punjab in the 18th century, at the end of the 18th century, this is the period of Waris Shah also, towards the latter half of the 18th century, and it is in this period that Waris Shah also had responded to this kind of socio-political turmoil of the time. It was also the decline of the Mughal Empire. So the kind of butchery, rape that accompanied partition, she associated that with the kind of death and destruction that Waris Shah witnessed in his own time, and created the figure of Heer and then the story of Heer and Ranjha to bring back or to foreground stories of love and faith and friendship, and you know, disregarding you know, the kind of turmoil that was around. Also remember, she has invoked the figure of Waris Shah because she is choosing a Sufi saint, and as we know, the strain of Sufism was very much anti-religious establishment. So they were not the established conservative religious. In fact, you know, taking on Bullhe Shah's train, you know, where Bullhe Shah, she was also very deeply influenced by all these saints, you know. And in fact, when somebody asked her, who are your contemporaries, she says, my contemporaries are Waris Shah and Bullhe Shah, because these are the people who negated any kind of Hindu-Muslim binaries or religious identities, and took on a very secular sort of humanist identity of being a subject who was then devoted to God. So Waris Shah as a Sufi saint fits in well at the time for her to speak about Punjab as a place which was deeply human and should take the course back towards humanism and leave aside its religious identities. Right. So this is something very important, because the Sufi tradition in itself believes in a kind of an intimate relation with God, and does not believe in ritualistic practices, does not believe in established religious roles, and in fact you know, distanced itself from it. So Bullhe Shah also said that you know, Bullhe ki jana mein kaun, you know, I don't know who I am, and he says, I'm neither Muslim nor Hindu. So you know, those are the kind of traditions that she is trying to invoke at the time of partition, reminding the people of Punjab what they stand for and what their tradition has been, what they are known for. They are known for celebration, for inclusive nature, for love and friendship, and not for this kind of butchery and this kind of violence that Punjab saw at the time. So you know, Waris Shah, just to give you a sense of Punjab's or the Heer Ranjha story. Waris Shah was the author of Heer Ranjha, and it is an epic that is sung in Punjabi, and and it has always been there, but he just revoked and brought again to life the story of Heer and Ranjha, just as you have Soni Mahiwal, etc. So he brought that story back, where Heer is the heroine and Ranjha is the hero, and Kaido is the hero, is Heer's uncle, who's the villain in that kind of tale. Now you find that Amrita Pritam takes this entire narrative and brings it to to reflect on the period that is the period of partition. In an interview, in fact, she mentioned, and I'd like to quote here, she says, "The partition of our country had a great influence on my writing. At that period, when I was suffering, when I saw the suffering of thousands and thousands of people, especially women, because they suffered in a special way, I was very moved. I wrote a full novel on that theme, The Skeleton. I also wrote a number of poems and a few short stories on this theme." So the theme of partition is a strong one in Amrita Pritam's works, and look at the poem itself, which was published in 1948, and in this poem, you find that she actually tells us, in her autobiography, Revenue Stamp, she actually wrote that, she said, "I'd barely begun to vent my feelings about the partition because she was uprooted from Lahore," and she says, "Then I went for a time being rehabilitated in Dehradun and then went to Delhi." Right. So she says, "On my return journey, I could not get a wink of sleep," she says, "on the train." And then she says it was pitch dark outside, and there was everything reminded her of sighs. The winds reminded her of people's sighs, the piercing sighs, and she could see the place burning. So these are some of her experiences that she charts in her autobiography, The Revenue Stamp. And she says that at that moment, I thought the words of Waris Shah came to me, and she says, "How will the dead and departed meet again?" And she says these words surged back in my mind, and she said, in a sort of an epiphanic moment, she said, "I could not think of anyone who would be greater than Waris Shah to chant my invocation to." And she said, "In a moving train, my fingers went on writing this poem, which is which is titled To Waris Shah, or Aaj Aankhan Waris Shah Nu." Now look at this poem. I'll just read some sections. There are several translations that are available. This particular translation is what Amrita Pritam herself very closely aligned to, and she in fact gave her name to. So she said that this is how she has translated her own poem. She says, "Speak from the depths of the grave, to Waris Shah I say, and add a new page of the saga of love today. Once wept a daughter of Punjab, your pen unleashed a million cries. A million daughters weep today. To you, Waris Shah, they turn their eyes." So of course there is a sense of there is some lyrical quality that that you can see, which is there in the original.
There's rhyme also in this.
Yeah. So she's been able to, though Amrita Pritam used to rhyme earlier, and then later in her life she stopped using rhymes also, and she moved in the direction of free verse. So yeah, there she's trying to recreate that kind of pain and suffering through the rhythmic patterns here and rhymes here. So, but again, turning to Waris Shah, that that he needs to open this book of love today and speak from the grave about the suffering. So in a way, I feel that there are two things that Amrita Pritam here is doing. One, she's invoking Waris Shah, but why is she invoking Waris Shah? Because as a poet, she understands the responsibility of a poet. That the poet in times of crisis, whenever there is a crisis, or if there is a war situation and people are at a loss and people have lost direction, it is the poet who returns with a kind of a direction or a meaning, and a sense of instills a sense of faith among the people. So she very much takes up that kind of a same role that Waris Shah took up in his own time, when he depicted the story of Heer and the love story of Heer and Ranjha at a time which was itself turmoil ridden, and performed the role of a poet who would bring people back on the track and suggest to them the ways, the way of life, or instill faith in them, instill faith in humanity. I think Amrita Pritam is also doing something similar because she is taking up her role as a poet at the time and speaking to people about about the need to bring love back in life. How do you see this, the role of the poet? And Amrita Pritam also, I mean, of course, too big a shoe to fill, and yet Amrita Pritam is also doing what Waris Shah did in his own time. Would you agree to that?
I would definitely agree, because in the 20th century, if there is one writer who is totally devoted to love, and love of the complex kind, love not in its fulfillment, but in it's an unrequited love, and therefore it goes on, and the writer is focused on the theme of love and the subject of love. So these things, and they are so wide in their scope, that they would cover the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, and on and on.
Right.
And the appeal will never die out. So this kind of a poet we have with us, and she is available both in English and the Punjabi language. And through English language, it relates so well with many poets of love from England and from America. So I think, and she as you say, she is widely traveled, and she was invited to different conferences. So all this shows that she finally becomes a poet of love, a poet of humanity, and a poet of unrequited love as well as pain. So pain is actually a hallmark of, if one can say that, of the 18th and 19th centuries historical turmoils. So I think it's very easy for us to relate to her on the plane of writing, on the plane of feeling. So this is what I say.
Yeah, right. So there is unrequited love in Heer and Ranjha's story as well, and yet she's focusing not on so much on that unrequited love, but on the poet who has been able to project or depict this suffering of the people in apt words, so much so that they have moved people around, and they have brought them back to their primal emotions of love, of of pain, or of understanding, or a kind of a sensitive portrayal of that past, where that all these women of Punjab are now turning to Waris Shah to speak on their behalf, because Waris Shah spoke about Heer and spoke about the plight of Heer or the pain of Heer, and was able to move an entire generation, so much so that people continue to sing Heers in Punjab, and with this kind of intensity. So in a way, she's asking Waris Shah to again find a way through which this pain can be voiced. And how will Waris Shah find that way? Of course, the Waris Shah will find a way through a poet who's living in that time, and then that becomes Amrita Pritam. So in a way, when she says that they all turn to Waris Shah, they turn their eyes towards Waris Shah, then she's referring to Waris Shah's way and Waris Shah's pen that could make people cry with his poetry. So in a way, Amrita Pritam is also suggesting that this is the task that she has before her, to use her pen as a daughter of Punjab and to bring to life the pain and suffering of million women who have been violently treated in this particular frenzy. And she says, awake, and she says, awake, decry your Punjab, O sufferer with those suffering, right? You are the one who suffers with the suffering. So again, I think it is as much about Punjab as it is about the poet's role and job at a time when the poet is required to become one with the suffering of those who have gone through this kind of turmoil. In fact, Amrita Pritam would often say that, wherever there is a woman who's fighting for her rights, she will find me in herself, I will be with her. So in a way, there is a sense of alignment, there is a sense of joining the suffering masses, or joining those who suffer. And she says, this is what a poet is known to be, a sufferer with the suffering. And she says there are corpses that are there all over, on the fields, and the chenab is flowing with blood, mingled with poison by some are the waters of 5 rivers. And this torrent of pollution unceasingly covers our earth. So in a way, she uses in this poem also the metaphor of agriculture, because again, this is, Punjab is known for rivers, is known for its agriculture, and she uses this metaphor of the river by saying that somebody has, poison the rivers of Punjab, so much so that now all these rivers, when they go and when they are used for irrigation, then they are going to flood the fields, and what is going to sprout from there, the saplings that grow from those fields, are also going to be poisonous. So in a way, I think the trope of poison, again she says this Punjab has become a kind of a cold, pale body, right? And she says because it has been bitten by snakes, with 1,000 snakes, and the venom has made the entire region of Punjab, of course there's personification there, that it has turned cold and blue because of the venom that has been put in it. So again suggesting that Punjab was known to be a place of love, known to be a place of music, and it has been replaced by venom, poison, and violent acts. So I think this is the kind of juxtaposition also that she is trying to create here in the poem, that the past of Punjab and the need in the present to turn back to that past and to bring back that kind of past that was known for its music, that was known for Ranjha who would play the lute, etc. So there is this sense of the present which is being then contrasted with the past that had all these musical strings and was known for its culture and celebration, and the present which is being stung by serpents and by snakes all over. So I think she's trying to build that kind of a that kind of an atmosphere of frenzy, of hatred that the present signifies. Another poem on the same line and on the same theme is called Helpless or Helplessness, which is in Hindi, basically in Punjabi what she calls Majboor, and then it's like just quoting just something very short from there. She says, "My mother's womb was helpless. I too am a human being. I am the mark of that bruise when independence dealt its blow." Unquote. So you can see that that the mother has been obviously in this case sexually assaulted, and she says my mother's womb was helpless but I am the mark of that bruise, that kind of scar I carry of independence. So independence as something which was a moment of jubilation but also a moment of deep sort of suffering for people who were living in Punjab, and talking about a woman who's, a girl who has been forced to become a mother, or a mother who's been forced to nurture a child that would constantly remind her of the scar of the violence done to her. So I think these are some of the poems that Amrita Pritam uses in order to create that suffering that women went through at the time of partition.
So friends, with the mention of the second poem and an elaborate understanding of the first poem, we come to the end of the first part of the discussion. And since it's poetry centered at the moment, and she has also, Dr. Bajaj has also gone into many ramifications of culture, of politics, of society, etc. So the discussion is going to continue in the same vein in the second part of the discussion soon after. Thank you.